Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kafuluma, and today I'm here to talk to you about a perspective of race from an outsider. And by outsider, I mean someone who didn't know he was black until he came to the United States. Today, I will share with you stories and experiences of race and dealing with it, and how my mindset on race changed drastically over a short period of time. I am from Uganda, which is a small country in Eastern Africa. Uganda is 98% black and only about 2% other ethnicities. Growing up in Uganda, race was something I hardly ever thought about, if at all. I guess for lack of a better word, race was not quite as venomous as it is in the United States. Conversations on race didn't get people's blood boiling quite in the same way that they do here. So I guess that's the biggest reason why I never could quite understand from watching the TV why race was such a problem in the US. When I came to the US, I found myself having to deal with certain things. And to give you a perspective of how I used to think about race, this is my friend, Kiki. Kiki and I lived on the same floor my freshman year. And I remember the first week of school, our resident assistant had us get together and introduce ourselves and get to know each other. And while Kiki was talking about herself, at one point she said that she was black. And I was sitting there, and unfortunately I said out loud, "You're not black, you're brown." See, I didn't mean any ill intent in saying that, but that's just how I thought about race, that it was just the color of people's skin, that there wasn't anything else attached to it. I also found myself identifying more with white people when I came to TCU. It's not because I liked black people any less than I liked white people. It's because of the simple fact that at TCU there are more white people than black people. At one point, someone called me an Oreo, which is slang for someone who has black skin but is really a white person on the inside. As time went on, I immersed myself more and more into American culture, and race was something I started having to deal with on a consistent basis. For example, one day at the school cafeteria, it was game day, so it was packed, and I was lucky enough to find a booth right next to this lady and her kids. And as soon as I got my plate, put my food down on the table, it seemed like the instant that I sat down, she moved her handbag, which was in between her booth and my own, and clutched it closely, almost as if she was protecting herself from the threat of a notorious thief. Unfortunately, I have never stolen a thing in my life, so I couldn't quite understand why she would think that I would. I also used to like running late at night to cool off steam from school, but I gave that up because one time I ran into a friend of mine who was coming from the library with her buddies, and I stopped to say hi and continue on my way. A few days after that, she comes to me and tells me that one of her friends was a little bit spooked out by me and said that I looked kind of sketchy. I didn't even know. I was pretty scared because I didn't want to spook anyone out or have the cops called on me for no good reason. I also got frustrated with the fact that many of my friends couldn't get past the fact that I was black. Many of my white friends would always introduce me as, this is my black friend Philip, or this is my African friend Philip. It seemed like there was never a time when I was just Philip. In so many of our conversations, it would always come up the fact that I was black or that I was African. And what frustrated me even more was that there were people who would be defensive towards me before they met me. But when they met me and they heard me speak and they heard my accent, it was almost like their eyes would light up, as though they were saying, well, you're black, but you're a different kind of black, so we can be cool. And that brought me into quite the dilemma because I didn't know if I was white or if I was black, and I didn't know why it should matter. I didn't understand why it was always coming up that I was black. I was growing more and more frustrated with my white friends, and yet at the same time, I didn't have enough black friends to help me understand what I was going through. So I started asking myself more and more questions about race. And like any good millennial, I turned to my good old buddy Google and asked, what is race? And Google said, race is each of the major divisions of humankind having distinct physical characteristics. Or race is a group of people sharing the same culture, history, language, much like an ethnic group. But these were the same ideas I had about race before. So I couldn't understand if race was just about ethnicity, then why was it such a big deal? So I delved deeper into the matter, and I found that in fact, race is just a social construct. See, I had grown up thinking that race was something natural, that occurred in nature. But in fact, it was man-made, that this isn't something that God made, so to say. It was something that we created to give power over each other. And I also learned that the way race, the whole concept of race is enforced is through racism. And racism is the prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism of a particular race over another in order to gain superiority over that race. See, now it started to make sense to me that in fact, it wasn't just about skin color, it was about power. And this went back hundreds of years ago from colonialism and slavery. So it was much more complicated than I had ever imagined. And so I asked myself, well, why is it still a problem? I thought to myself, well, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and that was over 50 years ago. So essentially, the Civil Rights Act took away that power the races had over other races, didn't it? So it should be an even playing field. But of course, that wasn't true. Not with the wide economic gap between races, or the lack of information we have about the day-to-day lives of other races, or the fact that sometimes we just choose to simply ignore the evidence and the facts. Sometimes we will see what goes on in TV, the police brutality, and simply convince ourselves that that's not really a big deal. But there's something else I think that hasn't been given much attention. The fact that we haven't realized that the concept of racism has evolved over the last few years. See, racism isn't the same as it was 50 years ago. I believe it has changed, at least for the most part, into something a little less severe, something I like to call racial tension. And racial tension does not encompass things as extreme as the things that would happen with the KKK, but it is still a problem because it creates these nagging little things that just keep building and building. For a white person, it might be someone thinking that the only reason you have a job or a nice car is because of white privilege. For a black person, it might be someone saying that the only reason you can go to college is if you're an athlete. And those things, when you hear them again and again, just frustrate you, and it just creates this tension and this divide between us. And of course, racial tension feeds off of stereotypes. We don't have the whole story. That's why we jump to conclusions based on the little that we have. So what causes racial tension? I think that is a lot simpler to answer than what causes racism. I think the biggest cause of racial tension is language. The words we use often, the words we see being used on social media or on TV or on Facebook or things like that. I believe that there's a power in words, a power that sometimes we don't really accept and really think about. And as far as racial tension is concerned, these words we use often reflect our thoughts on certain things. But most importantly, they affect the way other people think. For example, if you taught your son to think about a particular race in a certain way, of course he's gonna grow up thinking that way. They say that racism cannot be born, it must be taught. And that is the thing, we are constantly conditioning ourselves to think about race in a certain way. Take, for example, the following words: animal, beast, savage, cold-blooded assassin, unapologetic monster. The first time you hear these words, you might think, well, those must have been used to describe some maniac or serial killer that's probably locked up behind bars for life. But in fact, these words were used to describe someone you all might know: Lebron James. It's funny that we can use such harsh words every day in the news and on Facebook to describe someone like LeBron, and no one blinks an eye. And I do believe that LeBron is a pretty good guy, considering all the good work he's done in his community and all his social activism. And yet, no one hesitates, or very few people hesitate, to call him by such strong words. Yes, I do understand that LeBron is 6'8", 250 pounds, but that does not make him a monster. It does make him a really good basketball player, but that is about it. See, we need to be able to divide between the two. Physical aspects don't make monsters. Actions, if you kill someone, that makes you a killer. Throwing down a high dunk does not make you a killer or a monster. But because we have said it is okay to think in this way, or to say certain things, then we start to think in this way. So why do I bring up LeBron? Well, LeBron is just one in a group of people, athletes. Athletes are some of the most popular black people in the United States. So if we constantly on TV hear athletes or black athletes being described by words like monster, assassin, then why is it a surprise that the next time we see a black guy running on the street, we're gonna be taken aback? Of course we are, because we've conditioned ourselves to expect certain things from black people just because of the words we often hear and the words we often use. But it also goes past that. There's words like sketchy. What does that even mean? I didn't even understand it. I don't know what it means to be sketchy. Or words like jungle fever. And this is a word I think is used when a white girl has a history with black guys. Maybe she has a lot of black friends, or she has dated a couple of black guys. And then people say, oh, she has jungle fever. But I don't understand the relation between jungle and a white girl and black guys. Lions are in jungles. Leopards are in jungles, not people. Or words like inner city youth. See, I think this word is just a substitute for thug and gangster. I often hear it being used on TV in the news to describe young black people who are up to no good, so to say, because no one wants to use the word thug and gangster. So, how do we get past this? How do we remove racial tension? I think that's easy, because if the biggest reason for racial tension is language, then we need to think before we speak, because there is a power in words, but also we need to actually speak. We have to speak, we have to have these uncomfortable conversations if we are to learn from each other and find a way forward. And finally, someone might ask, why even bother correcting racial tension? See, I like to think of racial tension like a rubber band. All these tiny things we hear, you know, someone saying, oh, you're only wealthy because you're white, or you can only go to college because you're a black athlete. All these tiny little things just feed into that and just keep increasing the tension in the rubber band. And eventually it's gonna snap, and then we're gonna be right where we started with a full-blown racism. Thank you all, and have a good evening.